This is Connected Games Research, a series of lectures from leading scholars from around the world who study digital games from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives.
Dr. Ben Abraham is an author and researcher affiliated with the University of Technology Sydney Climate Justice Research Centre in Sydney, Australia.
Hi everyone, thanks Will for that question, and thank you also to the organisers of this series for the opportunity to present on some of my research and the kind of work that I've been doing recently. So Will's question is, what is an eco-critical game studies? And I think it's a really interesting question because to answer it, we have to actually step back and think about the bigger context that game studies is happening in, that we're living our lives in, and that is the context of a warming planet. So increasingly, all around the world, people are more and more aware of the challenge that climate change presents, the kind of effects on the natural environment that just sort of happen as we increase the amount of CO2 that we have emitted into the atmosphere, becoming felt more and more every day. We start to see them around us. Most recently, for me, I live in Australia. The mega bushfires that we had last year, at the start of last year, at the start of 2020, end of 2019, start of 2020, were unequivocally related to the extreme drought that we'd just been through, which the climate scientists tell us is related to the amount of emissions we've put into the atmosphere. And more people, I think, are seeing these sorts of effects where they live in their parts of the world. And they want to do something about it. And I think for me, I started this journey because I cared about this issue of climate change. And that led me to start thinking about what it means for games. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about the bigger picture, the global picture, for just a brief minute. So we now are entering a period of global action where most governments, most people around the world are convinced that climate change is happening. And we've got a target in mind. We know that we want to keep the amount of warming that happens to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the main mechanism for doing that is the Paris Agreement, which was agreed a few years ago in Paris. And most governments are now working towards some kind of transition to a zero carbon economy, a zero carbon future. A time not too far, hopefully, in the future, where we are no longer emitting carbon dioxide, where we're not burning fossil fuels like coal, like petrol and gas, liquid natural gas, things like that. And instead, we're relying on renewable energy. And as part of getting there, we have things like emissions trading schemes and targets in many parts of the world now, which are putting a price on the kind of emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. And what we're also seeing as well are more and more researchers talking about alternative economic systems. So things like circular economies, which are no longer focused on kind of generating waste and are instead about reusing things, and the idea of flat growth, of like how we can sustain our lifestyles without necessarily growing economies and things like that. And those things are all important to do because of the risks that come with climate change, the increasing risks of, in my country, Australia, bushfires, of droughts and floods, and all sorts of other natural disasters as well. So a few years ago, the man on screen, Timothy Morton, had a similar sort of realization that I think many of us are now coming to now. And he put a name to this feeling, or this idea, this way of thinking. He called it the ecological thought. Morton wrote this in 2010. He said, "The ecological crisis we face is so obvious that it becomes easy for some, strangely or frighteningly easy, to join the dots and see that everything is connected. This is the ecological thought, and the more we think about it, the more we consider it, the more our world opens up. And this got me thinking about games and where games fit in the climate crisis, and in particular in our actions to do something about the climate crisis. Because if everything is connected, then games are connected as well. Games are connected to the climate in a number of different ways. And so I think the first part of the answer to this question of what is an eco-critical game studies is it's thinking about how games are connected to the climate crisis. So that means asking a bunch of other questions, like what sort of carbon emissions are games making and where are those emissions happening? It means asking what sorts of materials, like plastics, rare earth minerals, rare parts of devices that come, have to be dug up out of the ground, these minerals and things, where are they coming from? What sort of emissions are associated with those minerals and those materials? And then it's also thinking about how are the workers treated who make these games and who make the devices that make the games. Because I think all of these together are connected to this question of how we're going to address the climate crisis in the next few years. So I'll come back to some of those issues in a little bit later, but another part of the answer to this question of what is an eco-critical game studies is asking this question, what can games do to help? And I guess and they're not separate questions, these are the same kind of question. And as part of thinking about that, like what games can do to help the climate crisis, I think it's also useful to think about what kind of games are being made already about climate change. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of them, because there's not too many of them. So they're sort of notable for existing, they're kind of important. So the first one that many people talk about is Fate of the World, which came out in 2011. And it is a kind of planning and strategy game where you put yourself in the shoes of someone who is tasked with kind of developing the world while also keeping climate emissions in check. So there's this sort of imaginary United Nations agency put together, and you're sort of the head of it, and you play through it by picking and choosing what sort of things you focus on. You might have a certain amount of money that you can spend, or a certain amount of resources to research things like, geoengineering, or do development in third world countries to lift people out of poverty and things like that. And so you have to balance the development goals of, keeping people happy and improving the living standards of people all around the world with keeping a lead on kind of the world's emissions. So that was the first kind of climate game that most people became aware of, and that sort of simulated the effects of kind of climate change. Another one that came out around about the same time, which was a little bit less detailed, a little bit less intricate, is Anno 2070. And Anno 2070 is a sort of city building game, trading game, sort of set in the future, in the year 2070. And you, as the player, have to kind of build a city, and you need to choose whether to industrialize and emit lots of fossil fuels, burn lots of fossil fuels to emit carbon dioxide, or whether you'll focus on renewable energy to kind of build your society. And really, the only kind of actual engagement with the idea of climate change that this game had was to kind of set the scene. And it's not a particularly detailed kind of engagement with climate change. Much more interesting title is Civilization VI and the Gathering Storm expansion pack from 2019. Which added sea level rise and a bunch of other climate change mechanics to the game in really interesting ways. There are some strange aspects to it in that if you've got the expansion installed, you can see what the sea level rise is going to be way back in the year 2000 BC, which is not particularly realistic. But it's interesting, and it's kind of there. And I think that really does show something about the kind of level of awareness and the level of acceptance that people now have in the general public of the issue of climate change. If it's turning up in really big, really popular games like Civilization, this is a really, really big series, then I think the issue is well and truly kind of settled for many people. And so it features all sorts of natural disasters that can befall the world, and so things like storms, floods, volcanoes, tornadoes, things like that. And that's kind of how it simulates climate change mechanically. Excuse me. So what games are doing to help already? I guess some of them are engaging with this question, but really there's not that many. There's not that many games that are kind of engaging with this issue of climate change so far. And so this brings me to the second part of what I think is part of this eco-critical game studies is this question that lots and lots of researchers are now interested in, which is whether games can actually make people care about the planet, and whether it can change people's minds, make them more concerned for the future of the Earth, and maybe make them change their behavior in some way. So here is just a really short list of a few of the scholars that have engaged with some of these sorts of ideas. So as early as 2013, Alenda Chang noted that computer and video games present a rich limit case for the claims of environmental scholarship, a place where the natural and the digital collide and prompt careful re-examination of our assumptions about nature, realism, and the visual. So Alenda Chang is very interested in the way that games could make people rethink their ideas about nature. And maybe that also applies to climate and the environment as well. Kiri Belgorn in 2013 has also argued for games that suggested they might have the ability to simulate changes that might influence players' beliefs about what environmental policy should be. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Maybe games can simulate the changes to, I don't know, different aspects of how cities are planned, for instance. Seems to make sense. Kelly and Nardi in 2014 suggested that good game mechanics can cultivate imaginative visions of situational potentials and solutions to problems. And Wu and Lee also argued for an entire genre of climate change games that offer powerful tools for education and engagement. And lastly, just as another example, Rajanan and Rajanan think that climate change gamification is an area that should get more attention. So just a really small sampling. There's a lot more scholarship out there that is really interested in this question of, can we make players change their minds or care about the planet? But I kind of see some challenges for this particular view. And the number one challenge is that climate change, for those people who still are not convinced that it's real, that it's happening, that we should do something about it, let alone what we should actually do about it, is that it's an ideological issue still. It's very much, for people who aren't convinced by the science, aren't convinced by the evidence, I think by this point, no amount of kind of stories or research is actually going to change their mind, because it's become an ideological issue for them. And the climate communication research sort of backs this up and suggests that this idea of an information deficit model of climate communication isn't really how it works. The idea that people just need to know more about it, that they need to know more facts and information, which is sort of what a lot of the games, eco-critical games persuasion type research suggests. Ballantyne says that doesn't really make sense. What we need instead is an interaction model of communication. And what that looks like is that constructs an idea of the participant, the person who's actually playing or receiving the media, who's being communicated to, and acknowledging that they are an active participant in that process. We can't determine what they take away or how they decide to interpret a particular bit of communication. And that's a real challenge. So Terry Eagleton, this guy here on the screen, who's a thinker, a kind of critical theorist, has written a lot about ideological critique and the way that ideology works. And the most important thing I think that he mentions, and this is from his book Ideology: An Introduction in 1991, he says that only those sorts of interventions will work which make sense to the mystified subject itself. So what he means there is that there's no point beating people over the head with like facts and the truth about climate change and the need to do something about it, because that's not how people get persuaded. We need to do something that makes sense for those people. And if they are ideologically opposed or resistant to the idea of climate change, then other approaches might be necessary. And this is also backed up by other parts of the games and education literature, like, for instance, James Paul Gee, who I've got a picture of here on screen. James Paul Gee has this really famous quote from his really foundational book called, I think, What Can Games Teach Us About Learning and Literacy? And he says this. He says, what ensures that a person plays video games in a way that involves active and critical learning and thinking? Nothing, of course, can ensure such a thing. What he means there is that if we want our players to learn something, maybe about the climate or about maybe about the environment, maybe we want to show them something new about the environment or about the planet, or something new to care about. We want them to care about planet Earth. Is there something that can make sure that they actually receive that information, that they're switched on, that they're paying attention and actually learning that thing that we want them to learn? No, there's nothing that we can do. We can't make people, we can't control their minds. And that's, I think, a real challenge for people who want to see games have an impact on their players. So my conclusions from all that is that games probably won't make a big impact on most players' views about climate change. But I don't want that to sound like a real negative kind of a thing. I think it just means we need to figure out other ways to contribute, or for games to contribute to the climate challenge. So to summarize my answer to this question of what is an eco-critical game studies, well, number one, whatever it is, it's happening in this context of already rising climate consciousness. And I think two of the key things that eco-critical game studies is it's thinking about how games can respond to the climate crisis, and it's going to be thinking about what ways games can reduce their impact. And we'll talk maybe a bit more about that a little bit later, about like what that might look like.
What are the ecological and climate-related issues within games as well as the game industry?
Great question, Will. So to answer it, I've broken it down into a couple of parts, because the main climate or environmental issues with games is their carbon footprint. So there are carbon emissions associated with a whole range of different parts of making games, or parts of the games industry. The first one is, making the games themselves. That's developing them, and that's mostly to do with the emissions of computers and workstations. So people make games on computers usually. They usually do it in an office or a studio environment. There might be servers, there are lights, there's heating, there's cooling. And all of that takes energy, takes power. And that power has to be generated somehow. And most of the world is not yet fully making its power through renewable resources. The second part is distributing games, getting them into people's houses all around the world. So we'll look at the carbon footprint of that kind of activity, and then we'll look at playing games and how much energy it actually uses to play a game. And then lastly, really briefly, we'll look at some of the materials involved in making gaming devices. So that's things like iPhones, that's the PlayStation, that's computers, and what happens to them after those devices are obsolete. If they break, we buy a new one to replace them. So to find out the emissions intensity and the carbon footprint of making games, of game development, I did a survey in the start of 2020. I put out a survey. I asked the game developers that I knew to try and fill it out for me and spread the word. And I got a range of responses from the quite small game developers who are maybe solo developers or working in a small workplace, up to those studios that have maybe 50 to 100 or even 200 people in them. And I asked them about how much energy their studio or their office used, and whether they, some other things about how much they cared about the climate crisis. The other thing that I also did to help me get a sense of this carbon footprint is I looked at the self-reported data that is increasingly a trend in many large corporations about their energy usage and their kind of carbon footprint. And so I found 4 companies that were disclosing their carbon emissions. So Rovio, the makers of Angry Birds, Nintendo, Ubisoft, and Sony. Although the Sony report isn't just about their games business, it's about the whole Sony company. So it's kind of complicated how to separate that out. It's not really quite clear. But together, what this represents is the scope 1 and 2 emissions of game development activity. And that is just fuel. So power or fuel consumed on location. So that might be a company that runs a generator, or that is burnt elsewhere. So that's coal, that's like natural gas, whatever other fuels there are that's generating power that this company is ending up using. That's the scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is part of the agreed upon greenhouse gas reporting standards. Scope 1 and 2 are the ones that companies are most responsible for, their most direct emissions. Scope 3 are the emissions that happen downstream, and that is the emissions the emissions that happen because of their products or services. And that, in this case, is players playing games. So I collected all that information and put it on a table here, which you can see. So it ranges from solo developers like Marbin X in Brisbane, Australia, to the small studios based in Hobart and Perth in Australia, to large studios like Wargaming.net Sydney office, which has about 100 people in it, Space Ape Games, 200 and something people, and up to Sony, which has 100,000 people, over 100,000 people in its global workforce. But as I said, that's not just games. That's the entirety of Sony. And for each one, we have a listed figure of how much power they used annually in kilowatt hours. That's the standard reporting figure for electricity used. And then based on if you know what's called the emissions factor for a particular area, and usually they are like kind of country-based or region-based, you can combine that amount of power consumed with the emissions factor, which is just a figure that tells you how much emissions happen per unit of power. And we arrive at a figure of CO2 emissions per annum. So how much CO2 that company emitted in a year. And I think the figures are usually for here, they're for 2019, basically, or averaged out for 2019. And we've also got a bunch of information about companies that are already using a lot of renewable power. And that's kind of encouraging. That's quite nice to see. And what that lets us do is divide the overall emissions over the whole year by the number of employees that they have. And excuse me, that gives us a rough sense of how emissions intense that kind of work is. So per employee, the companies like Secret Lab were really only emitting 0.07 tons of CO2 per year per employee. Whereas at the other end of the scale, companies like Sony, which manufactures a lot of things, makes a lot of smart TVs, makes a lot of devices, was emitting closer to 12 tons per employee. But that's not all of games, right? Like that makes sense. It's sort of a different industry in many ways. Sony aside, that gives us a sense of the range, or maybe a rough range of emissions intensity of making games. And these figures are mostly for office power consumption. The few companies that I talked to that had figures for flight and travel made the figure even higher, but I've kept that out of it here. This is just for the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So you can see from the range, we're somewhere between maybe 1 and 5 tons of CO2 per annum emitted per employee. That seems to be like a reasonable guess for for how intense games development is as an activity. And if we know roughly how many game developers there are in the world, we can combine that with the sort of intensity figure of somewhere between 1 and 5 tons per employee and arrive at this very scary figure of 85 million tons of CO2 probably emitted in 2019 for the entirety of the games industry. So roughly 17 million game developers in the world, times that by the kind of emissions factor, and we get 85 million tons, which is about the same amount of carbon emissions as the country of Bangladesh. So a fairly substantial global environmental impact just from making games. Games are not just a kind of fun leisure activity, they also have real world impacts on the climate. They are part and parcel of this climate crisis, and we'll need to kind of do some things about that. So there have been two main studies of the emissions intensity of distribution of games. The first one is by Mayers et al. From 2014, based on 2010 data. And they figured that about 1.2 kilograms of CO2 is emitted for every PS3 disc that gets transported and sold in the UK. Now, if we know that roughly 346 million PS3 games were sold in Europe, so roughly the same region, roughly the same area of the world, and if we assume that it's going to be around about the same emissions intensity for most of those games, then we know that it cost probably somewhere around 415,000 tons of CO2 emissions, or CO2 equivalent emissions, just to get games into the homes, I should say, of players in Europe for the PS3 period, or the PS3 generation of games. That's pretty substantial. That's not a That is over a long period of time. That's over several years. But again, that's a climate impact. That's emissions that we don't want in the atmosphere that we do need to kind of somehow reduce and remove eventually. So in 2020, a researcher by the name of Joshua Aslan worked with Sony. Mayers et al. Also worked with Sony, I should say, to kind of do a similar sort of study, but updating the data. And his research found that the number seemed to be higher now. 2.5 kilograms of CO2 seemed to be emitted per disk getting games to Europe. Excuse me. And that figure could be as high as maybe 200 grams more. This is my estimate. Required to get games to Australia or other parts of the world where long distance international flights, cargo freights are involved. And in my own kind of analysis, I've come up with this range of maybe 800 to 5,850 tons of CO2 could have potentially been emitted just to get PS4 discs to Australia in the year 2020. That's a pretty big number for just 1 year in a fairly small market, right? There's not actually that many. Australia's a very small country in the grand scheme of things, and we have a fairly large emissions intensity or fairly large carbon footprint. So an alternative to actually sending all these discs all around the world, shipping them up or boxing them up in containers, putting them on the back of a truck, loading them into cargo planes to fly them around the world, is digital distribution of games, which has been kind of more and more important to the games industry over the last few years. So Mayers et al. In their study found that it was unlikely to be the case in 2010, though, that digital distribution had a lower emissions impact than disk-based distribution. And that was because internet speeds were so slow back in 2010 that it took a really long time for players to download the game. And that meant using more power because their PlayStation console was on for longer. And that power was probably drawing on a fossil fuel-based energy grid. Now, fast forward 10 more years, and Joshua Aslan updated that research and found that there are some instances where, depending on the file size of the game, depending on where they are in the world, digital distribution probably is now, in some cases, lower than the disk-based carbon footprint. And there's also greater potential to decarbonize digital distribution as energy grids around the world shift to renewable energy, which I think is a really important thing to keep in mind. The decarbonization prospects for disk-based distribution is really quite unclear. It's not really, there aren't really any immediate technologies on the horizon that are going to allow us to move things around the world without any emissions at all. All we can kind of do at the moment is kind of send them in more efficient ways. Whereas if we have 100% renewable energy grids, all of that energy comes from renewable sources, then we can leave our PlayStations on as long as we like and download, everything, and it's not going to have the same kind of carbon footprint. So that was the second part. That was the second kind of environmental footprint. The third part is in actually playing the games themselves, and this is where these figures just blow out massively. So Aslan also did a estimate of the total European lifetime PS4 energy consumption. So that's all of the power used by all of the PlayStation 4s in Europe over their entire lifetime. And he estimated that figure to be 13 to 27 terawatt hours of power, which is a lot. That is a huge amount of power. But that is over several years. So it's spread out a bit. Um, he doesn't put a kind of carbon footprint figure on that number, but he does give us a figure of 6 to 8 terawatt hours of electricity consumption has been avoided through things like the PS4 in efficiency sort of initiatives, which means options to turn the PlayStation 4 off when it's not being used, or go into rest mode, and other kind of reductions that are basically hardware things, like just little changes in the behavior of the device that can kind of add up. And if we use a sort of rough figure of the average kind of UK emissions intensity of the power grid, um, we could kind of guess that maybe somewhere around 1.5 million tons of CO2 has been avoided being emitted by those changes in the 6 to 8 terawatts of power that wasn't used, which is kind of a good thing. That's like a kind of positive step. But yeah, again, if we use those same kind of UK average emissions figures, then that amount of power that was used by all of the PS4s in Europe up until 2020 could be around about 3 to 6 billion tons of CO2 emitted just from playing games, right? So this is everything from all the Uncharted games, to Call of Duty, to everything. Every PS4 game in Europe has added up to somewhere in this range, roughly. Billions of tons of CO2 emitted um, as part of playing games, which is not something we often think about. So the last part of the environmental impact of games, we've seen all these emissions to do with making games, getting them into people's homes, and in playing games is also in the devices themselves. So before any of the game playing has even happened, um, that device has been made, and it's been made out of fairly resource intensive stuff. Hardware manufacturers like Sony tend to keep all of the componentry and the details of how they're made kind of quite private. So we don't have a very clear sense of everything that is inside of these devices. And so it's very hard to put a figure on the emissions intensity of something like the new PlayStation 5 console. Apple does a slightly better job at giving us kind of emissions figures for their devices. And we learned from some of their reports that for most iPhones, the emissions over the entire lifetime of that device are about half the power used and half the emissions of actually making the device. So the devices themselves are extremely energy intense. And to kind of find out a bit more about this energy intensity and the kind of components inside a device, I asked the science lab at my university to do what's called a inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry analysis, ICP-MS analysis, on the PS4 main kind of brain chip, the APU. That's the combined CPU and GPU. And what they were able to tell me from that test is most of the mineral components that went into that CPU GPU chip. And there's a whole long list of them. I won't read the whole list to you, but some of them are toxic. Some of those components are really dangerous, or rare earth minerals, really expensive. And we know that the more expensive a mineral or material is, the higher the emissions intensity tends to be, because you need to actually dig out more rocks from the ground and crush them up to get these rare earth elements in sufficient concentration. You can actually use them. So things like titanium, gallium, palladium, cadmium, indium, barium, gold, lead, all of these things are inside the PS4 APU. Palladium in particular, and some of the other rare earth minerals cost like $500,000 per kilogram. because you have to dig up like whole mountainsides to even get like tiny, tiny amounts of the stuff. And that's inside the PS4. Little tiny trace amounts of it is in that. So emissions have happened to even get the device made and to the point where you can play a game on it. So this is just a really small snapshot of what I think is a longer and larger process of transformation of the games industry in response to this, to the increasing awareness of these issues of carbon footprints, of e-waste and hardware challenges. I haven't even talked about like what happens to devices once they're used up. Hardware recycling is still really not super well developed. We're still wasting a lot of materials by throwing out broken or old consoles and things like that. So there are really substantial emissions here, and a big part of it is going to be the kind of renewable energy generation revolution, which is kind of just kicking off. We're really starting to see it ramp up. Yeah, I hope that gave you a little bit of a sense of where the kind of environmental impacts are happening in and around the games industry.
What can and should the game industry do to reduce its negative environmental impact?
Okay, so that's the million-dollar question. What can and should the games industry do to reduce its environmental impact? So I have 5 recommendations that I think the games industry needs to kind of adopt in some form. But they all really come back to this first question, which is, or this first thing that the industry needs to do, which is commit to a carbon neutral games industry. This is the number one priority. Everything else, all of the other recommendations come back to this. They're all in order to achieve some aspect of carbon neutrality. And how it achieves the carbon neutral goal is still to be determined. It could be through the suggestions I'm making here. It could be through other ways. What is important is getting those emissions as close to zero and as quickly down to zero as possible. And these are just suggestions. They're very high level. There's not a lot of detail in some of them. Many of them we're going to need a lot more work to be fleshed out in the coming years. But the second suggestion, or the first one, I guess, of how to actually do this is to use renewable or carbon offset electricity. And this is a really great place to start for game developers, game players even, because it can be as easy as changing your electricity provider. In most countries now, there are electricity providers that will provide you with majority green electricity, so from renewables, or will offset the emissions that have been generated on their behalf for the energy that you use. So that's a really great way to do it, and it's not actually that challenging. For larger companies, if you've got a very big facility, say a big factory or an office with a large roof, installing rooftop solar could be an economical and actually quite cost-effective decision. In Australia, lots of companies are going that way now with solar panels on the roof to sort of offset their own power usage, particularly in a workplace where most of the electricity is being used during the day anyway, and so you can take advantage of the solar directly. The third recommendation is to measure self-consumption and emissions of the industry, and this needs to really start happening, I think, in a broader way. There are some companies out there, like the ones we talked about earlier, that have already started to measure their emissions and have kind of disclose what their energy use is. But if companies themselves can measure their emissions in real time and see, it helps to figure out what are the main things that like what are the main sources of power in your office, and then if you can reduce that power, you can actually end up saving money. So I think that's a really important direction as well. But if developers can record players as well and the amount of time that they're playing, record some statistics around when people are playing their games, how long they're playing for, and where they are in the world as well. And then if they can share some of that data, maybe in anonymized form or aggregate form, then researchers like myself or others can come along and look at what the emissions are of particular games or particular companies, and then do some things about it, because then you can offset it. You can buy carbon credits and things like that, or you can shift the kind of games that you make. So this is my fourth recommendation, which is to make games that maybe use less power sometimes. And there's a number of different ways that this could happen, right? It could be games for low power devices like smartphones and portable devices often have a much lower power consumption than, say, consoles and desktop PCs. So shifting your games to those platforms could be one way to lower those emissions. And the other would be to do something different with the way that your game works. So maybe you render at a lower frame rate, or you don't have as advanced particle physics, or you shift the time that players play into a time when there is more renewable energy in the grid, because renewables tend to be available during the day more often than at night. Or you can make games that are asynchronous, so that when renewable power becomes available, players can then play the game then. And a good example of this is something like the strategy game from a few years ago called Neptune's Pride, where you sort of logged on as a player, sort of intermittently. You set your orders up, your ships and fleets move around in real time, and you don't have to be playing it actively, like constantly. You just sort of log in every few hours. And that would be another way to kind of reduce the consumption of a game. And I'm sure there's plenty more. I think this is a space where I'm going to have a lot less ideas than developers themselves, who are going to be very, very creative, I think, and I hope can come up with some interesting solutions. And lastly, and this sort of follows on from the previous suggestion, is to push back against the hardware upgrade cycle. So the hardware upgrade cycle is, new phones coming out every year, new consoles coming out every few years. And one way that developers and people in the industry can push back against that is to make games that work on older devices. Anything we can do to extend the lifespan of an existing smartphone or an existing console, existing hardware, reduces the emissions that we need or reduces the amount of emissions, because we're not making new devices, which are costly. And another big part of this is, I think, a shift that the industry is going to need to kind of reckon with, away from the focus on photorealistic graphics and sort of cutting edge visual effects. I think we've reached a point already where there are very diminishing returns to increasing the level of kind of detail in games, and I think the kind of cutting edge video graphics cards all use substantial amounts of power. And again, if we can keep the existing ones that we already have and make them work for longer, make games that don't need us to upgrade our graphics card, then that's going to have a positive impact on the overall emissions. So those are my 5 recommendations for the games industry and what it can do to reduce its environmental impact. Committing to a carbon neutral games industry is, I think, the number one thing, and I think that has to be first on anyone's list and is really a non-negotiable. Without a carbon neutral target for the industry, all of these other things are never really going to work. They're not going to be something that actually makes a difference. But in order to do that, there are a number of things kind of within that carbon neutral goal that we can do already. So buying renewable power or carbon offsets for our electricity, measuring the energy consumption in our workplaces, in our server rooms, of our players, and making that data kind of public and kind of, taking note of it, just measuring it and knowing that we are emitting those emissions, I think already will change some perceptions in the industry. And then we can make different games as well. And I think this is probably the most drastic, at the most extreme end. We'd rather keep with the kind of games that we already make, right? Like we enjoy some of those cutting edge graphics. So, but how sustainable is it? I think there's a real question there about whether the Earth can really sustain the same kind of energy intensity and the same kind of games industry as we have today. I think there's a real question mark around that. And that's also related to this idea of the hardware upgrade cycle, which is the last suggestion. So push back on that wherever we can, resist the power intensity of graphics processing. That's often where a lot of it happens, and make older devices like last longer if we can. So thank you for listening to my talk. If you are interested in any of the ideas that I've been talking about, some of my publications are here on the screen. A lot of this work is based on the book that I've been writing, which is hopefully going to be out later in 2021, called Digital Games After Climate Change. So there'll be a lot more detail in that when it comes out. But you can also see some of my other publications if you're interested in any of those. And here is the bibliography that I used in this talk. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you learned something.